Good afternoon. I am an associate professor of English at Barnard College, just down the street. And I teach there in the English department and the Africana Studies department, and I'm also affiliated with the Film Studies and American Studies. This afternoon I'm going to give a relatively formal presentation because I have images and I didn't want to take up too much time and get out of control. So I'm going to stick with my script here. But I did want to mention that if you have questions about the images, I don't actually identify them, but if you have questions about the images, I'm very happy to talk about them after the presentation. My book, Slaves to Fashion, is a cultural history of the politics of black fashion and dress since the creation of the black diaspora, from the slave trade, which I can say here, to the present. Dress has been and continues to be one of the most important ways in which we project a sense of self, a class status, and a place on the spectrum of gender identities, sexuality, and nationality. This has been the case especially for black people, who, though materially deprived throughout history, have made the presentation of their bodies, their hair, their dress, certain bodily gestures, a key component and signal of their self-definition and political, social, and cultural possibility. Slaves were dressed by their masters. Clothing was used initially to define black people as subservient. Almost as soon as a slave was issued a piece of clothing, he or she understood that the garment served not only to protect him or her from the elements, but was also part of a power struggle over black identity. Refusing to be defined by others, blacks have countered their representation sartorially by pointedly playing with their clothing, manipulating it to better express the complexity of who they are. By examining cultural moments and artifacts that highlight the ability of dress, especially fancy dress, to both dictate and define identity, my book examines this power struggle between masters and slaves, between free blacks and whites, between upper and working class blacks at key moments and locations in black diasporic history. I look at the ways in which black people, once slaves to fashion, have made fashion their slaves. Slaves to Fashion began with a footnote. While researching W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, I came across a troubling reference to the fact that the revered Du Bois had been caricatured as a black dandy. This is not the caricature. My training in African American history told me that Du Bois was a philosopher, a historian, and a sociologist, a skilled rhetorician and lyricist. The image of Du Bois that I had was of an erudite, punctilious, quintessential race man. None of this prepared me for the footnote and the accompanying illustration from a political cartoon of Du Bois as a degraded buffoon, overly dressed and poorly comported, whose erudition had been turned into what the cartoon called, in minstrel speak, education. Only when I began to research the history of dandyism, and in particular the racialization of the dandy figure, did I realize that the complex strategy and history behind that caricature. Dandyism has been used by Africans and blacks to project images of themselves as dignified and distinguished. It has also been used by the majority culture and blacks to denigrate and ridicule black aspirations. My book examines the interrelatedness of these impulses and what the deployment of one strategy or the other says about the state of black people and their culture at different moments in history. Although dandyism is often considered a mode of extremely frivolous behavior, attentive only to surfaces and facades, and also considered a practice of white European elite, I argue that it is also a creative and a subtle mode of critique, regardless of who is deploying it. Though often considered fools hopelessly caught up in a world of fashion, dandies actually appear in periods of social, political, and cultural transition, telling us much about cultural politics through their attitude and appearance. Particularly during times when social mores shift, style and charisma allow these primarily male figures to distinguish themselves when previously established privileges of birth and wealth or ways of measuring social standing might be absent or uncertain. Style, both behavioral and sartorial, affords dandies the ability and power to set new fashions, to create or imagine worlds more suited to their avant-garde tastes. Dandyism is thus not just a practice of dress, but also a visible form of investigating and questioning cultural realities. Manipulations of dress and dandyism have been particularly important modes of self-expression and social commentary for Africans before contact with Europeans, and especially afterwards. In fact, in order to endure the attempted erasure or reordering of black identity in the slave trade and its aftermath, those Africans arriving in England, America, or the West Indies had to fashion new identities to make the most of the little that they were given. Whether house slaves or field hands, their new lives nearly always began with the issuance of clothes. Enslaved people, however, frequently modified these garments in order to indicate their own ideas about the relationship between slavery, servitude, and subjectivity. For example, there are documented cases of slaves saving single buttons and ribbons to add to their standard issue coarse clothing. There are examples of slaves stealing or borrowing clothing, that's in quotation marks, especially garments made from fine fabrics, from their masters for special occasions. Slaves created underground secondhand clothing markets in major cities to augment their wardrobes and to exchange clothing that identified them when they wanted to escape. In fact, many slaves dressed up or cross-dressed, literally, when they absconded, wearing clothing beyond their station or of the other gender in efforts to appear free and mobile. The black dandy style thus communicates simultaneously self-worth, cultural regard, and a knowingness about how blackness is represented and seen. Black dandyism has been an important part of and visualization of the negotiation between slavery and freedom. In Slaves to Fashion, I wanted in particular to use the black dandy figure to exemplify the interrelations between racial, gender, and sexual identity, and the way in which these categories are always expressed in terms of each other, but with different emphases and during different historical periods and geographical locations. In order to illustrate the black dandy's embodiment of this intersection of identity markers, I consider the pleasures and dangers of self-fashioning, as well as the politics of consumption and consumerism that define such stylization. For example, I note that the first black dandy in my book, a fabulous black man named Julia Soubise, famous in Enlightenment England for his beautiful dress and outrageous, defiant attitude, often held court in coffee shops that also offered slaves for sale. In this environment, he defied and ironically played with his own former status as a commodity, arriving at these shops in a chaise attended by white footmen, even as his brothers were bought and sold around him. Soubise's behavior reveals that during this time and forevermore, blackness is a complicated idea, wholly constructed and always already performed, yet also with real, lived effects. In order to illustrate the way that a black dandy can embody complex and even competing notions of blackness, meet Dandy Jim from Carolina, a theatrical figure made famous by the 19th century's most popular entertainment, blackface minstrelsy. His song in the minstrel show begins, and I'm not going to sing it, but I am going to say it. It begins, "I've often heard it said of late that South Carolina was the state where handsome niggers are bound to shine like Dandy Jim from Caroline. I went one evening to the ball with lips combed out and wool quite tall. The ladies' eyes like snowballs shine on Dandy Jim from Caroline." Narcissistic to a fault, Dandy Jim was certainly one of those characters whose self-aggrandizing attitude, accompanied by outrageous dress, titillated with equal parts threat and appeal. Going black in the blackface minstrel theater means much more than blackening up. The minstrel show was a world in which anxieties about the interrelation between race, gender, sexuality, and class seemingly had free rein. While largely overshadowed by the character Jim Crow, who was a denizen of the plantation, the blackface dandy was a particularly potent force in the antebellum minstrel show. In particular, Dandy Jim and his dandy predecessors, this figure, Longtail Blue, and the more famous, Zip Coon, provided a way for working-class immigrant white performers to ask questions plaguing 19th century Americans. These questions: what if blacks were free? What if they had access to money, education? What if they had unchecked social, cultural, and economic mobility? The blackface black dandy costume often an elaborate misquotation of elite fancy dress, and pretentious, loudmouthed, ridiculous, yet funny and provocative behavior, answered these questions, or at least attempted to represent them.